Roloff Farms sits on roughly 109 acres in Hillsboro, Oregon, and for most of the show's run, viewers were led to believe it was one continuous family property. It isn't. It never was. The farm is divided into multiple distinct parcels, each with its own legal designation. And in Washington County, Oregon, those designations come with strict agricultural zoning rules that don't bend for reality TV stars or sentimental family legacies. That detail matters more than almost anything else in the current drama surrounding Matt Roloff, because the decisions he made about those parcels after his divorce from Amy didn't happen in a vacuum. They happened inside a legal framework that has very little patience for people who try to work around it. I want to be upfront about something before I get into the specifics. Some of what I'm going to walk through today is documented public record. Some of it is my read on patterns I've observed from publicly available information, property records, and what's been reported. Where I'm speculating, I'll tell you. I'm not going to dress up opinion as fact and call it investigative journalism. That's not useful to anyone watching this. So let's start with what we actually know about the property. Washington County's zoning laws around agricultural land are not casual suggestions. Oregon, as a state, has some of the most protective farmland preservation laws in the country, which is actually something Oregon residents tend to be proud of. The state established a statewide land use planning program in 1973, and it created what are called exclusive farm use zones, commonly referred to as EFU zones. Land inside an EFU zone is protected from most residential and commercial development. You can't just decide one morning that your agricultural parcel would look better as a housing development. The process to rezone or subdivide that land involves county approval, environmental review, public notice, and in many cases, state-level oversight. It's intentionally difficult because the whole point is to stop sprawl from eating up farmland. Roloff Farms, or at least significant portions of it, falls under this kind of agricultural designation. That's not speculation. You can look at Washington County's public property records and zoning maps and see this for yourself. Now, here's where things get complicated and where I think people who only follow this story through the show's framing have missed some important context. When Matt and Amy divorced and eventually settled the property question in 2020, Amy selling her share to Matt for around $975,000, the transaction didn't resolve what Matt could actually do with the land going forward. It just settled who owned it. Those are two separate questions. And Matt, by several accounts, including his own comments on the show and in interviews, has been very motivated to monetize the farm. Whether that's driven by genuine financial pressure, a desire to see the land go to family members who would pay for it rather than receive it as a gift, or something else entirely, I don't know. My read is it's probably a mix of all of those things, and some ego involved in not wanting to simply hand over what he built. What became clear over the following years is that Matt was interested in subdividing portions of the property. He wanted to sell parcels. Some of that he's discussed openly. What he sold to Tori and Jackson was one parcel. Negotiations with Zach and Tori fell apart, partly over price, and that became a whole televised thing. But the act of selling individual parcels from agricultural land in Washington County isn't as simple as drawing a line on a map and finding a buyer. Here's where my read diverges from some of the more dramatic coverage you'll find online. There are claims circulating that Matt engaged in something like fraudulent zoning manipulation, that he secretly redrew property lines, that county officials showed up and slapped him with massive fines, and that he's now facing federal court. I've looked for hard documentation of those specific claims, and I haven't found it. That doesn't mean nothing irregular happened. It means I can't verify those specific details, and I'm not going to present them as confirmed facts when they aren't. If someone has actual court filings or county violation records that show this, I genuinely want to see them. What I can tell you is that property line adjustments and subdivision requests in Oregon do go through a formal county process, and Washington County does enforce its zoning rules. When people try to move faster than that process allows, or attempt to create parcels in ways that don't comply with EFU zoning requirements, there are consequences. Violations can result in fines, stop work orders, and in serious cases, forced reversal of any changes made. These aren't federal matters typically. They're handled at the county level, sometimes with appeals going to the State Land Use Board of Appeals, which Oregonians usually abbreviate as LUBA. So the mechanism for how a zoning dispute would actually unfold is real. The specific allegation that it's already happening to Matt in the way some sources describe it, I'm less certain about. What I think is worth taking seriously, and this is where my genuine concern about this situation sits, is the gap between what Matt seems to want to do with the land and what the zoning framework actually allows him to do. If he purchased portions of agricultural land with the intention of converting them to residential use or selling them off as buildable lots without going through the required rezoning process, he's created a problem for himself that's not easy to walk back. And based on how he's talked about the farm's future, the idea that it would be carved up and sold in pieces has always been part of his plan to some degree. The question of whether Amy had any legal standing to contest those plans gets into territory I genuinely encourage people to research beyond my summary. Oregon property law around co-ownership disputes and the rights of former co-owners after a buyout isn't simple, and the idea that Amy could have commissioned some kind of audit with legal teeth after selling her share is something I'm honestly uncertain about. It depends heavily on what the original sale agreement included. If Matt made representations about how he'd use the land as part of that negotiation and then acted contrary to those representations, there might be something there, but I don't have the actual settlement documents, and I'm not going to pretend I do. Let me shift to what I think is actually the most interesting and most underreported dimension of this whole situation, which is what it reveals about how Matt thinks about the farm versus what the farm actually is legally. There's been a pattern throughout Little People, Big World, where Matt presents himself as the visionary builder, the person who created Roloff Farms as an enterprise, and therefore the person most qualified to decide its future. And in a narrative sense, that's a compelling identity. He did build a lot of what made the farm what it is. The pumpkin patch, the themed structures, the tourism aspect, all of that was largely his project. But here's the thing. Oregon zoning law doesn't care about your narrative. It doesn't care that you built a pirate ship on your property or that your farm has been on television for 17 seasons. The legal framework exists independently of personal investment and emotional ownership, and it applies to everyone the same way. The moment you start treating your own land as something that should be exempt from normal rules because of who you are or what you've built, you're setting yourself up for exactly the kind of conflict that seems to be playing out here. I think Matt genuinely believed, and maybe still believes, that his relationship with the land and his history with the county would give him more flexibility than a stranger buying the same parcel would have. That's not an unusual way to think. A lot of longtime landowners develop that sense. But it's legally wrong, and acting on it has consequences. Now, the sale that fell apart with Zach and Tori is worth revisiting in this context, because I think people focused on the emotional angle, the family drama, the on-camera tension, and missed the practical dimension. If Matt had already made moves to configure parcels in ways that didn't comply with county requirements, any sale he tried to complete could run into problems during the title and escrow process. Buyers hire title companies. Title companies do searches. If there are unresolved zoning discrepancies or pending violations on a parcel, those tend to surface. That's not speculation about what happened in that specific case. I genuinely don't know what happened in that specific case. It's just how real estate transactions work, and it's worth keeping in mind when evaluating why deals might fall apart beyond the family drama version. What's been reported more recently, and this is where I want to tread carefully because the sourcing on a lot of this coverage is thin, is that Matt has faced some kind of pushback from the county regarding the parcels he's trying to sell or develop. Washington County does have a process for flagging and responding to zoning complaints. Those complaints can come from neighbors, from prospective buyers, from former co-owners, or from the county's own monitoring of permit activity. If a parcel suddenly shows up with a new configuration that doesn't match its historical designation, That gets noticed. The framing I've seen in some places that this constitutes fraud or that it rises to criminal conduct is something I'd pump the brakes on. Zoning violations are generally civil matters. Calling something fraud implies intentional deception with specific legal meaning. Could some of Matt's actions be characterized as attempts to manipulate the subdivision process in ways that weren't fully transparent? Possibly. But characterizing that as fraud with a straight face requires documentation I haven't seen publicly confirmed. Here's my honest take on the broader picture. Matt Roloff has spent years on television presenting himself as a capable, entrepreneurial patriarch who built something real. I think that's partially true, and I think it's also partially a persona he's worked very hard to maintain. The farm itself is real. The work he put into it is real. But the decisions he's made in the aftermath of his divorce, from how he handled the negotiations with his kids to how he's approached the property's future, suggests someone who is used to being the person in the room whose judgment goes unquestioned. And that works fine in a lot of contexts. It works less well when the person in the room is Washington County's zoning department. Amy's position in all of this is genuinely complicated. She sold her share. That transaction closed. The idea that she retains some kind of ongoing legal leverage over what Matt does with the farm depends entirely on what that sale agreement said. And none of us outside the situation have seen it. But it's worth noting that Amy has been publicly careful about how she talks about the farm and its future. She doesn't sound like someone who has no remaining interest in the outcome. Whether that interest has legal standing or is purely emotional, I can't tell you. The kids' situations are worth a few minutes here because I think this is where the human cost of the property decisions is most visible, even if it's the least legally dramatic part. Zach and Tori walked away from negotiations that, by Zach's own account, felt like Matt was charging them market rate rather than offering any family consideration. My read on that, and I could be wrong, is that Matt's attachment to the idea of the farm as his financial asset overrodes whatever sentiment he might have had about keeping it in the family on accessible terms. Whether that's driven by financial need or by some deeper need to be seen as the one who controls the farm's destiny, I can't say with certainty. Both things might be true simultaneously. Jacob has been more distant from the farm publicly for a while now, which predates any of this recent property drama. Whatever his reasons for that distance are, they seem to have less to do with zoning and more to do with older, more personal dynamics that the show occasionally hinted at but never fully addressed. Jeremy sold his parcel back. That transaction was resolved quietly, and I don't have a clear read on why or under what terms. What's left, if you step back and look at the whole situation, is a property that Matt controls, but that he's having genuine difficulty monetizing in the ways he apparently intended. Whether that difficulty is primarily legal, primarily financial, primarily relational, or some combination isn't fully clear from public information. The legal dimension is real. Oregon's land use laws are not going to make an exception for someone because they're on television or because they've owned the land for a long time. If there are genuine violations in how parcels were configured or represented for sale, those will surface through the normal county enforcement process. They won't be fast. Oregon land use disputes can take years to fully resolve, and they rarely have the dramatic arc that a television audience expects. There's no single climactic moment where officials show up and everything gets decided in an afternoon. It's mostly paperwork and waiting and attorneys billing hours. The question I keep coming back to is whether Matt understood what he was setting in motion when he made some of these decisions, or whether he genuinely believed the rules worked differently for him. I lean toward thinking he knew the rules existed and decided his situation justified working around them, which is a different thing from believing you're above the law. It's more like believing the law is an obstacle that clever people find ways past. That belief tends to hold up until it doesn't. Where this ends up, practically speaking, is unclear to me. If there are legitimate violations, the county will enforce them. If any sale attempts ran into problems because of how the parcels were configured, Those deals won't close until the underlying issues are resolved. If Amy or any of the kids have grounds to contest how the property was handled post-sale, that would be a civil matter playing out in Oregon courts, not a federal proceeding. The federal angle I've seen in some coverage doesn't match how zoning and property disputes actually work in this state, so I take that framing with real skepticism. What I think is actually true, underneath all the tabloid framing, is that Matt Roloff made a series of decisions about the farm's future that prioritized his financial and personal interests and didn't fully account for the legal constraints those decisions would bump into. That's not a unique story. It happens constantly with rural property in Oregon, where landowners who've had the same land for decades sometimes operate on assumptions that predate current zoning law, or that developed in a period when enforcement was less rigorous. The difference here is that everything Matt does is documented on camera, discussed in tabloids, and analyzed by a large audience of people who have a lot of emotional investment in how the story turns out. That visibility doesn't change the legal situation, but it does mean there's more external pressure on how it gets resolved, and more people watching to see whether the rules apply to Matt Roloff the same way they'd apply to anyone else. My honest answer to that question is yes, they do. They have to. Oregon's land use framework isn't optional based on who you are, and Washington County isn't going to look the other way because someone has a production company filming on their property. Whether that's satisfying as a conclusion depends on what you were looking for. If you wanted confirmation that Matt committed fraud and is heading to court in a way that will be televised and resolved by next month, I can't give you that because I don't think that's what's actually happening. If you wanted someone to lay out why the decisions Matt made about this property were legally risky, and why those risks are now becoming real in ways he probably didn't anticipate, that I can give you, because the public record supports it. The farm he built is real. The legal framework he's running into is equally real. And the outcome of that collision is still being determined, probably slowly, and probably through processes that are a lot less dramatic than the coverage suggests. If you've been following this situation and have seen actual documentation of the specific violations or court proceedings that some outlets are referencing, I'd genuinely be curious to hear about it in the comments. I'm not trying to be the last word on this. I'm trying to be accurate about what's confirmed versus what's being inferred. And in a story this messy, those two categories are worth keeping separate.